see everybody here this morning. We had a long day yesterday, and the reason we allowed 3 days for the course was so you wouldn't get too tired, particularly too tired in translating to English all the time. I think we would like to try and finish today if we can, but I don't want to rush the last session, which is a big session on how you deal with the journal, how you deal with the editor, the referees, things like that. So today we will cover the discussion section, selecting your title, and writing the abstract. So we'll see how we go on those topics for the next 2 hours, and then make a decision about whether we'll try and finish everything this afternoon or not. Today we have quite a few, well, we have 2 class exercises for you to work through to learn some of the things that we'll be talking about. So let's just quickly go back over what happened yesterday. Firstly, we talked about the results section and focusing on that first, because you have to work out what story you're going to tell. That will influence the data that you include in your manuscript and how you will present the data. And we talked about tables and we talked about figures. We then went on and talked about the method section, or the materials and method section. And we talked about it including all of the information required so that the reader had confidence in the results that you present. And we talked about the materials section starting with all of the general information about the project, then the specific information, and then the statistical information. After that, we talked about the introduction. And remember the discussion about the world and Thailand and Bangkok and KMUTT. Same thing with your introduction in your scientific paper. Start with some broad general statements, which are typically statements of fact. Then lead into a summary of what everybody prior to you has published in the field of your study. Then a statement about the gap, about the challenge, about the deficiency in knowledge, followed by a statement of your objective or your aim or your hypothesis. Remember all that? Yes? And the point about those various steps is if you use those steps, it means that the big job that you're tackling can be broken down into smaller parts and be made easier. And that applies to writing a scientific paper, it applies to writing your thesis, it applies to writing a grant application, it applies to writing a report on a commercial contract. So what you're learning in this course, you can apply in other reports that you are writing. Remember also, we said keep your sentences short. You can always link them together afterwards, but try and do that. Try not to have long sentences. We also talked about using punctuation if you're confident enough to do that. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can get some help to check that you've done some of these things and done them well. Are there any questions that you've thought about overnight or this morning about what you heard yesterday? No? Okay. All right, let's talk then about the discussion section. And I have to say that for me, in my career, this is always the hardest one to write. It's hard to think outside of your immediate data and think about the implications of your results and how they relate to everything that everybody else has studied in that field. I also think that PhD students and master's students find it difficult to discuss their data beyond just describing it. So I'll give you some rules, some directions that should help you to write this particular section, just like we did yesterday with the introduction. Now you need to check with the journal that you're writing in, or indeed with the university that you're writing your thesis in, to find out whether they have separate results from discussion sections, followed maybe by a conclusion section, all with their own titles. Or do you have a combined results and discussion section, maybe followed by conclusions? You also need to look, and we'll see some examples of this in a moment, look to see whether the journal typically uses subheadings. I said to you yesterday, I think using subheadings can be very, very helpful. They break up the text and they give you defined topics to focus on. It makes the writing a lot easier. It seems a bit of a strange thing to say, but the content of your discussion should be consistent with the title of your paper. Because the title of the paper signals the general field of your study, and that's what people will be expecting you to discuss. So don't pick some fancy title that you then don't talk about when it comes to the discussion. And some people spend a lot of time, and we'll talk about titles later, thinking about titles which are pretty fancy, but they actually don't relate very much to the study. And the discussion should connect with the introduction. Think about it for a moment. I'm reading your paper. I've read the introduction. And then I go off and I read a whole lot of materials and methods, and I go through a whole lot of results. By that time, I might have forgotten what the aim of your study was, what the hypothesis was that you were putting forward for testing. So you need to remind me in the discussion, and many people forget to do this, and again we'll see some examples of it in a moment, forget to remind me what the objective of your study was. So it's quite useful at the start of the discussion to connect with the introduction and cover again, briefly, the research need, the gap, the objective, the aim, the hypothesis, whatever it is that you've framed it up as at the start of your discussion. Now that's quite nice because it gets you moving into the discussion. You're repeating part of what was in the introduction in different words, and we'll have a look at some examples of that in a moment. Alright, so 6 steps for you to write the discussion section. 6 steps. 6 different processes that you can go through that break up the discussion into manageable pieces. I've already told you the first one. Start with referring to the main purpose of the study, the aim of the study, the hypothesis that you're putting forward. Put that at the start of the discussion. It gets you writing. It's something that you know about. It's easy to put down. Secondly, restate the most important findings of the research. Now, I don't mean restate your results, but restate the trends, the differences, the things that stood out in presenting your results. Restate those. Whether they support the original hypothesis, whether they met the research objectives that you had, whether they agree with the results of other researchers. Our results are similar to those of, and you can list a number of references. However, they contrast with these people that found something different. You know how to do that, so this is the place where you will do that. Thirdly, an explanation as to why you think you got that result, supported by other people that have come to the same conclusions or made the same explanations. Then you have to be honest and talk about what your study didn't achieve. Because if I'm reading your paper, I need to know what you thought didn't go right with your study, wasn't perfect. Or perhaps you just worked on one cultivar and you need to tell me that it would be nice if you'd have studied 3 cultivars, because cultivars might be quite different in their responses. So the discussion needs to be honest about admitting limitations in the work that you've done. We talked yesterday about you having a number of different audiences when you write a paper. Sometimes it's other scientists, sometimes it's people that work in the field and advise farmers, sometimes it's people that write bulletins for farmers. So what are the implications of your study? Scientifically, practically, whatever it might be, you need to help me as the reader understand how that work that you've done relates to either the science in that field or to how that science might be applied if you're in horticulture or post-harvest or an area like that. And finally, recommendations for other research. If you were going to do some more research in that field, what would you do? If you were moving on and thought that other scientists should continue to study in that area, what would you recommend that they do? So those are 6 steps, and we'll have a look at some examples. All right, so could you have a look at paper 5 that I've handed out? Again, it doesn't matter that you don't have to understand the science, but you do have to understand what the sentences are saying around the 6 points that we've just mentioned. Now, on the top left of page 5, you'll see where I've cut and pasted the information from the introduction. And then you'll see as I've marked up number 1, how the authors have picked up the information from their introduction and repeated it using different words. Then you will notice that 2 and 3, a statement of the important findings and an explanation of the findings, alternate all the way through that page. Probably with the most important findings first. The big findings first, and then the smaller findings subsequently through the different paragraphs. You'll notice typically they've combined 2 and 3, a statement of the findings and an explanation for those findings referring to other papers in one paragraph. You'll notice that they only have 1 4, and it's partway down the right-hand column. The effects of such compounds on insect viability and behaviour are complex, and may depend on both the organism and the presence of other compounds. So they're drawing to your attention the limitation in the study. In other words, you might need to look at other compounds, you might need to look at other insects to understand whether the findings in this paper apply to other situations or not. Then a 5 down the bottom, the implications, and a 6, a recommendation for future research. Alright, any questions? Take a few minutes just to have a wee read there and make sure you understand what those 6 different sections mean. Alright, now if you could have a look at handout number 6. Now here the authors have just gone straight in to stating the most important findings of the research. They don't remind you of their objectives. They don't set the scene. So I start reading their discussion and I've got to remind myself, or I've got to go back 2 or 3 pages in the article to remind myself what the objectives of their study was. They haven't told me. So you can see immediately that it's quite difficult to remember. You haven't got the whole paper, but it's difficult to understand from the outset what their discussion is really focusing on. They do a good job of restating the most important findings and relating those to earlier literature. And if you turn the page, they don't admit to any limitations. So they did the perfect study. I don't think so. There are no limitations, no number 4. They have one number 6, and it's hidden away in the middle of the text. Not very helpful. And they have a couple of number 5s, maybe 3 number 5s about the implication. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just not as helpful as the first example I showed you, and it's not as well structured. The first one went 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one goes 2, 3, 6, 5, 2, 3, 6, no 4, and it's harder to follow the logic through the text. We won't spend time on that. You can have a look at it tonight. You can go through that and just compare those two. So now have a look at number 7. Number 7, again on the mid-left, I've clipped and pasted the statement of the objectives from the introduction, and you can see there number 1. They've repeated some of that information for you to set the scene in the discussion. But what I really like about this discussion is the use of subheadings. And you can see one with the arrow alongside it, sweet orange. If you turn the page, you'll see lemon-like citrus, you'll see grapefruit, you'll see sour orange. So they have broken up the text with subheadings. They've made it easier for me to read, for you to read, the information about each of the different species. Notice also that instead of having 2 followed by 3, they have 3 followed by 2. So what have they done? They have summarized the previous literature and then related their findings to that previous literature. And that's quite a nice approach as well. So you don't have to go 2-3, you could go 3-2. And if you restate the previous literature, you're then showing your results in relation to the main findings that are already known. And again, if you read through this example when you've got time, you'll see how that falls into place very, very well. Now, I've cut this one short, so there are no 4s and there are no 6s, but be assured they were in the original article. But they came at the end. So right at the end of the paper, they talked about some limitations and they talked about recommendations for further research. But notice that within each species, they talk about the implications of the study for that species. So this is just another way of doing it. I quite like it because of the subheadings. I think they make it much, much easier to follow through the text, and it breaks it up so that you're not having to read page after page to get the main messages. I should say that they also broke up the introduction with subheadings that were the same as the subheadings that they used in the discussion. Okay, so let's just briefly summarize that. The first one that you looked at had 6 components. It divided nicely sections 2 and 3 in a sequence, so they restated their main finding and then they put supporting evidence in to show what that finding was. In the second example, there was no reminder of the purpose of the study. They had again a nice interaction and interchange of sections 2 and 3, and they had a good section 5 on implications of their work. Remember, nothing on limitations and nothing on recommendations for future research. The one we've just looked at, very nice use of subheadings, but note the reversal. Remember the reversal of 2 and 3. They put 3, the supporting evidence, and then a summary of the finding. Now, if you pick up paper number 8, what I'd like you to do is try and identify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on that handout. So just take a pen, start reading, and I'll just go back to remind you, there are the 6 things that I want you to look for. See if you can mark those up on page number that is numbered 8. I'll let you take about 10 minutes for this because you need to just read it through and look for those 6 steps.
Okay.